Today we're going to be comparing the Cybex Priam and the Stokke Trailz, and if you've watched our other videos you might be wondering how these two strollers are even comparable, being that they're clearly of different classes. Well, that's true, and a lot of the points we're going to make in this comparison will actually relate to the differences between these two classes. In one important way they are comparable though, and that's price. Both of these strollers sit right up there at the top of the price range, somewhere right above a cheap used car. So if you like both these strollers but haven't given much thought to how each will best fit your needs, then keep listening, because we're about to explain what you'll be getting with each of these models. We'll start with a few statistics. The Trailz weighs in at about 14 kilos versus 8 kilos for the Priam, so almost twice as heavy. Both of them take a child of up to 17 kilos in the seat, which is standard. It means that you can use the stroller up until the end of your stroller use. When you're folding it down, the Priam is 95 by 58 by 31 centimeters versus the Trailz at 95 by 50 by 63. So the Priam doesn't really fold that much smaller than the Trailz. When you're looking at the underslung shopping basket, the Priam takes about 5 kilos in the curve versus 10 for the Trailz. So the Trailz has double the weight capacity. Okay, we'll start with a few notes of comfort, both for you and your child. The seats are about the same size on both of these strollers, but the Priam, at least with the Lux seat, is far more adjustable. On the Stokke, the seat is just a bucket seat. So the actual form of the seat does not change, just the position of the seat. While on the Lux seat, on the Priam, you can adjust both the back and all the way down into a flat position, which is actually somewhat uncommon and nice on the market, as well as the footrest, which of course can go up and down. In relation to folding and storage, the Priam is also a little bit easier. It's lighter, it folds down a lot smaller if you have a smaller car, and it has this very handy fold that involves not taking off the seat, where you can flip the seat entirely forwards and thus fold it down. In relation to textiles and removal of textiles, if you need to wash your stroller, the Priam is also a bit easier to remove the textiles. It's also a little bit easier in relation to maintenance, simply because it does not have air-filled tires, and thus you don't have to pump it. Both of these strollers will require a little bit of spray grease in order to maintain the mechanisms functioning properly. The shift here is going to come with driving. The Trailz is far more capable of driving than the Priam, and that has something to do with class. So the Priam, again, is a mid-size class, and it's going to function really well in urban and light terrain environments, whereas the Trailz actually does have terrain capability. This is because it has bigger air-filled tires, very solid suspension, protective suspension pads in the front wheel housing, and it's just generally a sturdier chassis, and it has a lot of extra weight, which makes a stroller just better to drive in general. Moving on to mechanics from top to bottom is now when you're going to see the real differences between choosing a heavyweight or Cadillac type stroller versus a mid-size type stroller, because that extra 6 kilos, that all went into thicker, more quality mechanisms and construction materials than it did on the Priam. So, looking at the handle and the central fold mechanism, you'll notice immediately that it's thicker. It's adjustable up here at the top, which in some cases can get weak after a while, but in the case of the Trailz, it's actually very, very strong. The Priam is going to have a lot of loose points all along the handle and running down into the central locking mechanism. All of these are going to make the stroller a bit more rickety over the years. This is a new stroller. You can see it's already quite loose in the connection point between the upper end of the handle and the lower. One nice thing about the Priam in terms of other mid-size strollers is that it is rigid between the handle and the front frame along that axis. It doesn't shift, so that means that the central locking mechanism is a little bit less complex than you get with a lot of mid-size strollers. But still, it's not going to have the same strength and durability that you're going to get with the Trailz. Looking at the lower back end of the strollers, the first thing I will point out is that the suspension on the Trailz is just amazing in comparison to the Priam. It has this very large, heavy suspension unit in the center, which allows a lot of moving over bumps and terrain without it really jerking the stroller around and making it uncomfortable to drive. Whereas the Priam, you can see it has some suspension, which is nice for its size class, but really it doesn't do very much for going over difficult terrain. I generally find the Priam to be difficult to drive even on light terrain like gravel or dirt roads. We're not even talking about forest paths and so on now. The other thing on the back end is going to be the brake system. So the Priam has this central brake pedal, and there have been several people who have complained about the positioning of that pedal, in particular because it becomes activated if you load up the shopping basket with stuff, or when you're using the two-wheel position. Of course, on the Trailz, the brake lever is a bit over to the side, and you don't wind up having this problem. The other thing about this is that the materials that the brake system on the Trailz is made out of are simply more sturdy. It has large metal pins that run into the wheels on both ends. They are spring-loaded. On the Priam, you don't actually have metal pins, you have a small metal wire which is coated in plastic, and even from initial purchase you can start having trouble where the wheels don't easily unlock, where they get caught up on one side and you have to turn the stroller a little bit in order to make it roll properly again. You can have these sort of problems on the trails too sometimes, but you really have to overload the stroller and not maintain it properly for a few years in order to develop those kind of problems. And over time, the parts for the brake system on the Priam are more likely to break, so that you'll have to actually replace them as opposed to just fix problems via lubrication than you get with the Trailz. Okay, looking at the front ends, you're again going to notice that the Trailz is a lot larger and more sturdy. In relation to the Swivel Locks, they're about the same. One is activated from the fork upwards, the other is from the housing mechanism downwards, but they both function in the same way, which is a pin that will lock inside a hole. If you take out the front wheels though, one thing that I'll point out on the Trailz is that it has this large heavy-duty suspension pad. It's spring-loaded and it pushes the fork up against the locking mechanism here. You don't have anything like that in the Priam, and the purpose of that is in order to limit the amount of damage done by the axle as it spins around and presses against the sides of the housing mechanism inside the stroller. Over time, if you don't have preventive measures like that spring-loaded pad, what happens is the axle widens out the channel inside the housing mechanism, and the front wheels will begin to wobble if you go at higher than normal speed as that whole connection point wears down. In addition, of course, there's a big difference in size of wheels in the front end, and that coupled with the whole air-filled tire setup makes the front end on the Trailz to have a lot more suspension, a lot more off-road capability. Okay, looking at the wheels in general, again, the front wheels, the size difference is going to matter a lot in relation to terrain. But looking at the back wheels are of course the same size, and you have a few different wheel options for both of these strollers. On the Priam, there's not much difference between the wheel options. They have a terrain wheel which has some like bumps and studs or something on top of the rubber, and it's about a 1/2 inch wider, so it'll give you slightly better terrain capabilities, but it's not going to make a really big difference. Overall, the wheels for urban driving and light terrain suburban driving on the Priam are quite nice. There's a quality rubber on the tire, and for that sort of mid-size urban light terrain environment, these are quite good wheels. Don't have anything really bad to say about it. In relation to the Trailz, the air-filled tires do add a certain amount of suspension, and with an overall sturdy chassis and additional suspension in the chassis, it is very terrain capable. You do also have the option of having the classic wheels, and I don't have those here. Those are not air-filled, and in my opinion, they're very inferior to the terrain wheels. Also, the material that the tire is made of is inferior to the material on the Priam. So if you're going for the Trailz, I do recommend getting the air-filled tires. They are better. As I mentioned at the beginning, other than a similar price tag, these two strollers are really in different classes, and thus focus on different characteristics to fit different needs. A Cadillac stroller like the Trailz is a mobile base, capable of carting a lot, going virtually anywhere, and lasting a long time even with a bit of rough treatment. The Priam, by contrast, is not this capable. It is for urban and smooth terrain suburban use, and is more relevant as a purchase if you have size and weight considerations. Small car, a lot of need to fold and carry your stroller on a regular basis. The Priam also consists of generally more fragile construction with lighter materials and a lot of connection points and adjustable mechanisms along its chassis, making it hard to compete with the Trailz in terms of longevity. So then, long story short, if you've decided on one of these two strollers, it's going to come down a lot to lifestyle, where you live, where you'll be strolling, how big your car is, and so on. Do note though that even if you decide that Cybex fits you better for these reasons, it is not my top pick for the medium class. It's a decent stroller, don't get me wrong, but currently I would rate the Fox as better in this size and weight class. The Trailz, by contrast, is currently my top pick for the heavyweight class, and if you had the chance to try both of these strollers over a period of, at most, a couple months, you'd probably understand why. Again, assuming that your life doesn't make the Trailz simply too large and heavy to fit your needs. We hope this video has been interesting to you, and if it has been, we ask that you subscribe, as it helps us to continue making videos in the future.